I'm by the lakeside with Nick, who's been visiting Kedleston for the last 20 years and currently surveys overwintering wildfowl that use the lakes at Kedleston. He's going to tell us a little bit more about bird life on the park.
Well, the park's incredibly rich for birds, and of course the best place to see things is on and around the lakes, because the birds are out in the open mostly, and so at any time of year there's always things to be seen. Of course you've got the obvious birds like the mute swans and the coots with their white noses, and a variety of ducks and an occasional heron. And quite recently, in the last few years, we've been getting little egrets, which are like herons but smaller and totally white, with black legs with yellow feet, so they're very easy to identify. And they come round the margins of the lakes hunting for small fish, that sort of thing, and it's lovely to see them. So if you're new to the park and you want to see some birds, the lakes are really the best place to head for first, because that's the easiest place. In addition, particularly in the summer, we get great crested grebes, particularly on the bottom lake, and sometimes they nest if they can find somewhere to make a nest out on the middle of the water. If there's a dead branch sticking up, that's what they'll use, and so they're lovely to see in the summer. And in the winter we get a lot more variety of birds coming from north, from Scotland, from Europe, come to Britain in the winter because it's milder. So in the winter you've got a much greater range of ducks, for example. In the summer you've just probably got mallards and maybe tufted ducks, but in the winter you get teal and pochard and shovelers and gooseanders perhaps, and widgeon, and of course the mandarin ducks, which are fairly recent birds. They're actually Chinese and they look absolutely splendid, the males do, and they're starting to breed in the park and throughout Derbyshire now. So, but in the winter we sometimes get 30 or 40 or even more than that on the bottom lake and at the far side. So you're going to need a pair of binoculars to see them. They're not quite as easy as the swans to see, but they're lovely birds, and I say the winter really is the best time to see them. Kingfishers do occur, but they are really, really hard to see, partly because they're small, they fly very quickly, and although they're a lovely electric blue colour, you've got to be really on the ball to see them. And they feed, I think, up and down the stream either side of the park, but they do come onto the lakes from time to time. So if you're very, very lucky, you might just see a kingfisher, but you know, it doesn't happen all the time. They are quite difficult to see. Now, other birds that you might see include birds that are smaller birds, like wagtails, that feed around the edges of the lakes, and we've got the pied wagtail. They also feed on the roof of the hall, where they can get lots of insects, so that you can find them up there, or indeed on the mown grass in front of the hall, you can find them up there. And the other wagtail that we get, particularly associated with the lakes, is the grey wagtail. Although it's called a grey wagtail, it's mostly yellow, which is confusing. And they are really attached to the water and the water's edge, and they feed on the weirs and on insects that they get picking in amongst all the weed on the weirs. And you know, they're around. They occasionally breed, but not always. But you can see them sometimes in the summer and very often in the winter. So there's a terrific variety of birds to be seen, particularly around the lakes. But don't think that that's the only place you can see birds, because there are birds flying in the sky, of course, and birds in the woods. And the woods are really lovely in the springtime. By the summer, you've got all the leaves come on the trees, and it's very, very difficult to see birds. And they're also much quieter then because they've stopped singing. But if you come to Kedleston in March and April and May, there are a lot of birds singing and setting up their territories and mating and that sort of thing. So there's a lot of noise in the woods. And we've got birds like blackcaps and robins, and some of the things you'd get in your garden, but some of the things you don't. And one of the constant noises in the woods at any time are the jackdaws. There is a good population of jackdaws. They nest in the holes in the old trees, and I don't know how many there are. There must be probably 100 pairs or something around the park. So they're very noisy with their chack-chack calls, and you can hear them at almost any time of the year. Even in the middle of the summer when everything else has gone quiet, the jackdaws are noisy, you can be sure. And on a nice day when there's a bit of thermals and the wind's blowing gently, you get them spiralling up in a big spiral above the woods, which is great to see. Obviously there are crows, occasionally rooks come into the park. There's a rookery not far away, and they dig their beaks into the ground to pick insects, cranefly larvae and that sort of thing from the grasslands. Very occasionally we get a a raven. We've got a group of children, I think, going by overhead, but that's great. The more children in the park, the better, and let's hope they're looking out at the wildlife that's around. So yeah, ravens pass through the park quite regularly, and they make this very, very deep cronking noise. So they're splendid birds, much bigger than a crow, and with a nice wedge-shaped tail at the end. So they're well worth looking out for, particularly in the winter time and the early spring. Buzzards, of course, fly over the park all year round. They do nest both in and around the park in tall trees. They build big nests, usually well hidden away in the top of a tree. But they've got these big broad wings, and they love, on a good day like today when there's a bit of wind and sunshine and a bit of a thermal, they love circling around and soaring over the woods in particular. So they're very regularly seen over the park, particularly in the mornings when the thermals are getting going. In the afternoon they tend to go back and roost, and they're not so active, so the morning is generally better. A group of birds I haven't mentioned is the swallows and the martins, and I've just been reminded because the house martin's just flown by. Now, the house martins build these mud nests on buildings, and in fact there are some on the front of the hall. So if you look when you're going to have a cup of tea, if you look up, you'll see their mud nests high up above you, and these birds with their small birds with their little white rumps dashing in and out of their nests. So those are the house martins, but also regular are the swallows, and the swallows build inside the loggia at the back of the hall, and they nest inside on beams, whereas as I said, the house martins build these mud nests on the outside. But they're often hunting for insects over the lakes and over the grass as well, and sometimes if the weather's really bad, the only place that they can get insects are insects that are emerging from the water. So particularly in the early part of the spring, you can get 100 or 200 martins and swallows flying low over the lake, busily feeding on a day when it's very difficult to find insects anywhere else. So really, whatever time of year you come to Kedleston, and whatever the weather, even if it's poor weather, you're not going to see some of the birds circling up like the buzzards, but there's always something to be seen. So it's an exciting place to come, and indeed it's one of the best bird watching places in the county. So keep your eyes open, and you'll definitely see all sorts of things. A couple of birds I haven't mentioned are the geese, which you will definitely see. There are two species. There's the grey lag goose, which is effectively a grey goose with a big carrot coloured beak, and then there's the Canada goose, which has got a black and white neck and head. So they're really quite different. They're about the same size, and both of them breed in the park, and so you'll see them feeding on the grass and sailing around on the lakes as well. I think that covers probably many of the birds. I think we've probably seen 70 or 80 different kinds of birds in the park over the years, but some of them of course are rare or difficult to see. There are of course the blue tits, the great tits, the coal tits, the robins, the kind of birds you'd get in your garden as well. But it's a great diversity here at Kedleston, and it's really a good place to come if you want to do a bit of casual bird watching.